So you've got billions of people on these platforms and these social platforms. But if you sit them down as individuals, and certainly here in the United States, they will tell you how fiercely independent they are, how fiercely autonomous they are, how critically important their personal freedoms are. And in some ways, what we're discovering here is that they are actually slaves, and have almost no independence, unless they really decide to turn it on, in this mimetic process. Mm-hmm. And if you say that to them, they'd be highly offended, I think. Mm-hmm. When you deal with that, you're dealing with quite the opposite of what you've just described. Okay, you say awareness is the starting point, but I think where people are is in this great unconsciousness. How do you draw them out of that unconsciousness and into this awareness about the way that mimetic desire is impacting their everyday life?
I could tell you a very short story about a friend of mine, Nicholas Christakis, who's a professor at Yale. And he very famously, he and his wife, there was a controversy on campus that I won't get into the details. It had to do with Halloween costumes, and there was a very famous video of him where he was on campus and really confronted by a crowd of very angry students. I mean, these things were almost on the verge of getting violent. It was one of the first, I think this was 2016, if I remember correctly. And the students, this kind of anger is very mimetic. Anger is one of the extremely mimetic emotion. Somebody else next to you is angry about something. It's contagious, right? So there's an element of contagion about mimesis, and being in crowds that sort of turn into mobs is a very dangerous place to be. Nicholas said that in that moment, he said, as students were confronting me, sometimes, groups of 5, 6, 7 at a time, he goes, I would ask them, well, what's your name? And he goes, I asked that question very intentionally, because when I asked them their name, it's almost as if they had to remember who they are and gain some self-possession back, right? Address them as an individual and didn't treat them as part of the crowd. And I thought, that's incredibly wise thing that he did. He ended up sort of very calm. He was incredibly calm throughout this process, and really diffused this, and ended up having personal conversations one-on-one with the students, but started by asking them their name. I think there's something very powerful about that tactic that he used that maybe we can learn. It comes down to personalizing our interactions with others, knowing others and being known is one of the most important, one of the thickest desires that every human being has. We want to be known. We want to know other people. We don't want to be treated like one more instantiation of a species, just somebody else in the crowd. We want to be known as I want to be known as Luke, right? I want people to know me. And I think the church has to do a much better job at that. I think all of us we need to repersonalize our culture a bit. Social media is kind of a depersonalizing force. It sounds ironic because everybody's on social media, saying what they think, but at some level, it's difficult to see the person behind the profile sometimes. And I think one answer is kind of these highly incarnational encounters with people where they're known, and as they are, is, I think, a way to kind of pierce through some of this. And that doesn't necessarily, part of what you're asking is, well, how do you get people to stop realizing that they're not these completely autonomous people? I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but I do think that I do think relationships are the answer to a lot of problems, right? Like, where relationships heal, relationships help us become who we are, help us to know who we are in and through relationships. And the more personal they are, the better. And we come to an awareness of, all kinds of things about ourselves, including our own mimesis, I think, in relationships.
Okay, so let me ask this, because as I was reading the book, probably more the second time than the first time, one of the questions I was really grappling with is, are what you call thin desires, thick desires, are the thinner desires more dehumanizing and the thicker desires more rehumanizing or repersonalizing, as you talk about? And are the thinner desires more crowd-like behavior, and the thicker desires where we really come into our unique self? You talk about writing the book that only you can write. That's not a thin thing. You don't come to that through a bunch of thin things. You come to that through some depth. You come to that through reflection and whatever else, and probably really good people around you speaking into that. But is it too simple to say that our thin desires are more crowd-like and our thick desires are really who we were created to be?
Well, I think that's a very important distinction. I do believe that thick desires are rooted in a deep kind of Christian personalism, and are deeply connected to vocation and calling, right? I mean, our thick desire is who we're called to be. That's one of our thickest desires, and I don't think it's an oversimplification. But the only caveat that I would make is that I wouldn't want somebody to think that there are thin desires and then there are thick desires, because it's not that they're not that separate, right? I mean, oftentimes they have desires evolve. I love sports, and there were years when I would just get together with my buddies for some beers to watch football on Sundays. Perhaps that's a thin desire, and we've been doing that for a long time, and then there's some thicker desire underneath that to get to know each other better. And, guys often need something to do in order to talk. And, there's all kinds of things, there's all kinds of reasons. But I would say that there's a bit of both in that kind of tradition that we have to get together, and, we can't go through life. There are certain things that, what am I trying to say? I think that we also shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. I mean, I have some desires that are thin desires, to go eat at a restaurant or something like that, here in the city. And my wife and I both love food, and, that's not something I'm going to feel bad about. It's like, so I think just realizing, though, that there is a different quality to desires, and if we live our whole lives pursuing thin desires, that begins to be a problem. And what do we have that roots us or reminds us of the thick, those things that are enduring, that are connected to a deeper sense of calling and purpose and meaning? I do believe that thick desires are the locus of meaning and purpose, sense of fulfillment, where we kind of find ourselves, and can connect with others. I certainly didn't write this book based on thin desires alone. There might have been some thin desires in there, but I wouldn't have been able to do it because it was an incredibly difficult process that took me several years. I wouldn't have been able to do it unless there was some deeper, thick desire in there, which was, to give expression and to communicate some truths that I think are very important for people to understand, to make them accessible. Without that, if I was driven by thin desires, I would have given up on it, halfway through. It wouldn't have been enough to sustain me.